This podcast is brought to you by the Love Serve Remember Foundation and Ramdas.org. Here we are again, Ramdas Here and Now podcast, and I'm Raghu Marcus. And let's see, today I found an old talk. When is this from? It's not that old compared to how old they can be, since he started doing this in the 60s. This is from 1993. So, at that time, he was, contemplating finally aging, even though, at that time he's, in his 60s or something, where I am now. And, so even bringing up this whole thing and, presenting this, we have quite a varied audience, I would say, here that's listening to these podcasts. So I'm a little hesitant to present material on aging to people in their 20s and 30s or even 40s. And it's funny because he talks about up until he was about 50, his reference to age was probably, he said, about 12 to 14 years old. And I can relate with that. We all can relate with that, and so it's something that we all absolutely put way on the back burner, aging. We don't want to think about it until you actually start falling apart. He has some funny anecdotes here. I just loved the talk because it was a talk at Omega, by the way, which is a great retreat center in the New York area. Yeah. He just, he's funny. And he tells some funny stories about the trials and tribulations of finally facing that you are getting. In this case, he got on a train. He was talking about getting on a train, and there was a good rate for senior citizens. So he was all happy to. In his mind, the conductor was going to come over, take his ticket, and he was going to hope that the conductor said, "Wait a minute, let me see your ID here," as if, like when he was 18 trying to get a beer and, he was forced to show his ID. I, on the other hand, had so that's one way of denying the whole thing. Myself, I remember going with my wife to a movie theater and, just turning, 60, I don't know what it was, 60, maybe it was 62. And she says to me, "All right, we can get the senior rate for you here." I said, "Shut up. I'm going to pay more. I don't want to know about the senior rate." That was just another way of getting into that denial. Ram Dass wrote a great book, by the way, called Still Here. Actually, I don't know how many years ago it is. It's I think pre-stroke, I believe. And it is about aging. It is a fantastic book, by the way. And of course, in it, if you're over 50 and you're starting to think about this stuff, it has everything in it about how we deny our aging process. We go to the gym, we color our hair, we get divorced and act out like teenagers. Men do, anyhow. And in fact, I was with Ram Dass one time. I think I must have just thoroughly read the book. And I said to him, this book you wrote is making me crazy. Everything you say in here is, and in terms of denying aging, I'm doing. I colored my hair. I don't do that anymore. I'm a Pilates fanatic, trying to keep a flat belly. I could go on and on. Of course, and he lists all his stuff. He was going to Gold's Gym too. Got a trainer and, some really boogie boarding in the, adventure retreat or some crazy shit. And he got, a wave threw him up onto a coral reef and he got completely cut up. So in other words, if he can go through this denial, boy, we all can go through it, and we all are going through it. So, so even if you're 25 and listening to this thing, I think you can get some good information, even though you probably won't be paying much attention to it. And at least you'll get a laugh out of some of this, as we call them, altar cuckers, who are, past their prime. Really what's being, Ram Dass does point out here that we are living in a system that's way out of balance. Our zeal for independence and individuality has left us alienated from the structures of family, community, and nature. The way that, and we're talking about the way, elderly people get shunted. As soon as you see anybody who's, walking a little slowly or driving 3 miles an hour in front of you, you go out of your mind, right? We have really, in India, which, we spend a lot of time with families in India, and, the elderly are so revered there as depositories of wisdom, and they are looked upon from the smallest children to middle-aged people to provide guidance and so on. This has been pretty well lost in this culture. Unless you're, a famous person, an artist or someone or something like that. But, we just shield ourselves from that process, and this is all about change. And another thing, the nature of aging is changed, and we're fascinated with watching the changes. But when it starts to happen to who we think we are, that fascination turns to fear. That's very insightful and very true. As there is a lot of fear associated with change, and it can be you out there at 25 years old who is having some changes, starting out in life, and they can become fearful. So the idea of practicing getting behind, to who we really are, regarding the fact that everything is constantly changing, is a great practice that will benefit when you do get to a place where the body change is a radical slap across the face. Not that some of these other changes aren't: losing a girlfriend, losing a wife, losing a job, going through a change of location, and all of it. That not to denigrate those kind of changes, but certainly the change that happens when you start to lose your faculties is pretty, can cause a lot of fear. So, I have to say that one great thing that we picked up in India, and I've mentioned it on this podcast, and I'm sure you've seen it in other places. Ram Dass has certainly talked about it, and that's there is a certain meditation that many of us that have been in India with Maharaji have practiced, called a Vipassana meditation, which is insight meditation. Sharon Salzberg, who's been part of many of the retreats that we've been doing with Ram Dass, and actually Jack Kornfield and Trudy Goodman, his partner, are going to be with us this December at the big Open Your Heart retreat. That's the first announcement. You're the first to know about that. And Joseph Goldstein. These are people who primarily brought this practice back to America. And there are many teachers teaching it now, but these three are very special people. And it's insight into the knowing of, or experiential process of understanding that constant change is part of nature. So it's a very, I mean, it is a wonderful practice that really, if they do these 10-day meditation courses that you can get anywhere around the country. Just look it up, Google it up. But after the 10 days, I mean, you do come out of there with some great insights into the fact that there is nothing solid here. Nothing stays the same. And this is all tremendously helpful stuff. Let me see what else he talked about here. See the way in which the spiritual journey is one of going deeper and deeper into your being, behind that which changes, to find that which does not change. And another one is, see the process of aging in itself is a creative act. This is all, to really turn us around from the way in which we deal with aged people and the way we deal with it ourselves when we get there. Again, the system that we have been living in, that we are now living in this culture regarding this, is, it's a tragedy. And you see it in the papers all the time, and now especially with people living, much older than they had in the past. The other thing that is probably really useful, I mean, obviously practicing, as I mentioned, this particular meditation, Vipassana, insight meditation, to gain some of that insight, that's useful at 18 years old. Okay? Because practice makes perfect. And when you go through changes, you definitely need to be able to fall back on something. Okay, no more pontificating, although I do want to mention this, talking about awareness. That's one of the things, of course, we all need to develop, awareness and mindfulness. But the concept of awareness and, is truly intrinsic to our ability to move with all of the changes that go on in our lives. And we become, and sometimes that awareness, we become fascinated by what we start to perceive in front of us, what we become aware of. And sometimes we miss the boat, though, because we miss the notion of what awareness is of itself. It is a state of being that we can become identified with, that is not as rustled by these changes that go on. So this is a great talk. Again, excuse me to all of you younger folk out there who are definitely not thinking about aging at this point. But I think in this thing, we're going to call it, Ram Dass calls it, what does he call it? He says, we're going to speak today about change. So although he's talking about aging, the idea of confronting change, I think that's an essential thing, and an essential for anybody of any age, that because we're all dealing with that on a moment-to-moment basis. All right, here we go. Sorry, I've taken up all your time here, and in terms of where's Ram Dass, well, here he is, Ram Dass, here and now, talking about change.
Last year I was on a late evening train, and the station was closed, so I had to buy the ticket on the train. And I had just become 60. So when the conductor came, I said to him, I'd like a senior citizen ticket. And what I felt when I did that was just what I had felt when I was 18 years old. And I had been from Boston where the drinking age was 21, but I went to New York with some friends and the drinking age was 18, and I went into a bar and I said, I'd like a beer, with trepidation that they wouldn't serve me because I was too young. I had the same feeling with the conductor. But he immediately made out the ticket for the senior citizen. I said to him, don't you want to see my ID? And he said, no. And I was shocked. Because until I was 50, I think I saw myself as somewhere between 12 and 14. And then around 50, I started to grow up and I began to consider the fact that I was possibly an adult. So that in earlier years when I had been in my 30s and a student would come in and say, sir, may I see you? I would take it as a joke. But when I became 60, up until then, I had really treated age as rather uninteresting. And I was busy being spiritual, and spiritual people don't focus on age of the body. But I decided when I was 60 to milk it, to see what I could get out of it, to see if there was any work I should do. So instead of, usually I'm traveling during my birthday, so people can't have birthday parties, but this time I told everybody I wanted birthday parties, and I had many birthday parties. And because 60 was a key year, I have studied in the East a great deal, and at 60 you become a sannyas, which in the stages of life, from 0 to 20, the ashramas or stages of life, from 0 to 20 you're a student, from 20 to 40 you're a householder, raising your children, earning money. From 40 to 60 you start to do spiritual studies and pilgrimages and practices. And at 60 you throw over everything and you are you're totally free. And 60 is such a key point. In this country it's a little more confusing because you don't know whether you retire at 55 or 60, and Medicare is until 65, and so you don't quite know when the mark is. There's no clear rite of passage as to when you're old. But I really wanted to milk it, and I realized that I got caught in it. And for about 6 months, I was really busy being 60. I looked at my hand, and I saw my father's hand, and I thought, there's a 60-year-old hand. Bone and blood vessels and wrinkles and spots. Wow, spots. You know, the Porcelana ad says, it says they call these spots aging spots. I call them ugly. Isn't that an extraordinary ad? I mean, to create suffering. I mean, the other way of looking at it is they call these ugly. I call them aging spots. But what I had done was I had internalized at some level, more or less consciously, the social clock of aging of our society. Because we are basically a hunting tribe, and what happens to old people in hunting tribes, since hunting tribes have to keep moving, is old people are left behind and they're treated as somewhat irrelevant. And since economic productivity and social roles of achievement are so stressed in this society, in this youth society, I began to feel like it was time for closings rather than openings. I should look at the projects I had left to do maybe I should consider retiring from Seva Foundation. Maybe I should do my last book. I mean, I was really climbing into it. Maybe I should take 6 months a year now off. And I started to notice I've traveled and I use carry-on baggage because I don't like baggage claim waiting. So I noticed that the corridors to the plane seem to be getting longer. And I thought, aha, it's happening. And I reacted to it in interesting ways. Part of me was sort of steeping myself in, okay, what's it going to be like to be older? I'll slow down, I'll honor this. And the other part was doing this bizarre behavior where last summer I spent some time helping my colleague build his house with adobe bricks. And I would be in this long line of people, all of whom were about 20 to 30-year-old Mexican laborers, and me and my friend, and the bricks weighed about 30 to 40 pounds, and we would toss them up the hill from one to another. And we would work from 7:30 in the morning till 5 at night, at which point they'd go out to dinner and to play. And I would stagger to bed. But I wouldn't give up. I did it. And then I thought, well, my body's out of shape. So I went to Gold's Gym. And I got a trainer. And now Gold's Gym is wonderful because it's where everybody comes, all those kind of really muscle-bound, huge forms, you know, these things that, you know. And they have mirrors all around the sides for these people who admire themselves, but because I'm nearsighted without my glasses, I couldn't see in the mirrors. All I saw were these huge forms going by, and so pretty soon I was starting to walk like this, because since I couldn't see myself, I just assumed I was one of them. And but the trainer, as we went through the regimen, at one point I was sitting there deciding whether I would live or die, and she said, "Are you all right?" And I knew she wouldn't be asking that to one of them, so... I remembered my father's little poem, "It's not the crow's feet under your eyes that make you old, or the gray in your hair, I'm told, but when your mind makes a contract your body can't fill, you're over the hill, brother, you're over the hill." But I wasn't ready to give up, so in November I went with a 33-year-old friend of mine to the South Pacific to do 2 months of boogie boarding. And for those of you that don't know, that it might have passed you by, a boogie board is a plastic board, and you go out in the waves and you ride on the wave. So I found myself in Tahiti and in the Marquesa Islands, and my friend would leap into the surf and rush out to get the waves, and these waves are coming in, and I would be struggling to get through the wave, and I'd get out there and there were all these, not only weren't they 60 years old, they weren't 50 and they weren't 40 and they weren't even 30. I mean, they were about 15, and only one person gets a wave, it turns out, if you really want to ride the right place. So I was fighting these 15, 20-year-olds, and at one point I took a wrong turn and I ended up on this coral reef with the waves pounding down on me and the coral cutting into my legs, and you know how long it takes for coral to heal, and everybody was screaming at me to do something which I couldn't hear over the waves, and I thought, what am I doing? Is it possible that I could say enough already? I've saved my father's cane for whenever. There's a lovely Chinese story about that, about the old Chinese man who's retired. He's too old to work in the garden, and he's sitting on the porch, and his son is tilling the garden with his son as a wife and family. And the son looks up at the old man and he thinks, you know, he's so old, he just eats food. What good is he? He says, no, it's time for him to be done. So he went out and he made a wooden box, And he put the box on the wheelbarrow, and he rolled the wheelbarrow up to the porch, and he said, "Father, get in." The father got into the box, and the son put a cover on the box and started to wheel the box towards the cliff. And as he got to the edge of the cliff, there was a knocking from inside the box. And he said, "Yes, Father." And the father said, "Well, I understand what you're doing and why you're doing it, son, but might I suggest that you just throw me over and save the box, because your children will probably need it later." But one of the things that's helped me from not getting too trapped in our cultural models is that I do travel a great deal in other cultures. And in other cultures, I'm always surprised at how different the feelings are that are generated around variables. Like in India, when I went there last time, 2 years ago, one of my lovely old friends up in a village in the mountains said to me, "Ramdas, you're looking so old." He said, "You're so gray." Now, at first, my reaction to that was my Western cultural reaction of, "Oh, God, that's terrible." But then when I quieted down, I heard the tone with which he was saying it. He was saying it with great respect and delight. Like I had now become one of the elders of the society. And he was saying, "Wow, you've done it. You've grown old. How great." And what I have found is that after I live in places like Guatemala or Malaysia or Thailand or Burma or Italy or France or Spain or Polynesia, where there are extended families, where everybody has natural roles within the structure, and where old people are part of the families and the old and the young are wise fools together, and the whole thing is quite built in, then you come back to where this culture, where we have, quote, an aging problem. And I realize that we are gathered here because of our cultural pathology. That were it not for that, we wouldn't need this so much, because in many cultures this was all built in a natural way, and in our zeal to be independent, we have thrown away the baby with the bath a little bit. And we've ended up where we have alienated ourselves across generations instead of embracing ourselves across generations, and creating these kinds of supportive communities where the roles of elders are obvious and clear. In our society, of course, where technology moves so fast, we get outdated, so that the question of what wisdom elders have that is useful. I mean, I'm only at word perfect 5.0, and I realize now that I already can't talk the language of my friend's 12-year-old son. And I moved from a typewriter to a computer, and I kept saying to myself, "Old dogs can learn new tricks, old dogs can learn new tricks, old dogs can learn new tricks," and I put it over my computer. But I don't know how many more old tricks I'm going to learn, and I may just decide to be outdated. But I think that we have to recognize that we are living in a system that has gotten out of balance, in which the zeal for independence and individuality has left us alienated from the structures not only of family and community, but from nature, in ways that Zalman was talking about, from recognizing our identity as part of biotic communities and part of other things, that all of which give an intuitive, innate meaning to aging. And they give you a feeling of the appropriateness of the place. Most of us live in urban areas where we are living almost totally surrounded by the projections of the human mind. And very rarely are we living so close to nature and earth that we are experiencing in our blood and our being the cycles of cold and warm, of leaves falling, of the feelings of nature, of death, of birth, of aging. And It's a harsh reality at one level, and it's the horrible beauty of the wisdom of nature that we often have shielded ourselves from, and in that shielding we have lost something because we've been afraid to look at the nature of aging and death. Robert Kestenbaum says, the limitations and distortions of our core vision of what it means to be a person in our culture becomes starkly evident in old age. If to be an old person is to suffer abandonment, disappointment, and humiliation, this is not a geriatric problem. It is the disproof of our whole shaky pudding, technology, science, and all. If our old people are empty, our vision of life is empty. Now, what, as Eve's song talked about, the changes, Stevie Wonder's song, the nature of aging has to do with change, obviously. And the nature of changing phenomena is that they are endlessly fascinating. We get fascinated with that which changes. When it starts to happen to who we think we are, the fascination turns into fear. The first level of change that we have to attend to is the physical nature of change with aging. As I read this list, it'll be very familiar to many of you. Arthritis, neuritis, insomnia, constipation, poor circulation, high blood pressure. I went to the doctor the other day and he said, you have high blood. He said, your blood pressure's high. He said, would you do whatever you do to lower it? I said, what I do to lower it is not visit doctors' offices. That's what I do. It's called the white coat blood pressure. Nervous tension, atrophying muscles, bones breaking easily, motor nerve signals slower, lungs less oxygen, loss of mobility, can't hear as well, can't see as well, run out of steam sooner, days when you feel sick and nauseous, questions about continence. Now, those changes themselves are so fascinating that I can take you to whole societies in the sun in St. Petersburg, for example, where there are hundreds of thousands of people who are endlessly reciting the lists of these changes to each other. Mostly their own fascinate them the most. However, they do listen to each other so that they can give fair hearing, so that they can have time for their own. But you don't say, how are you? And that's real, and it's very real, and it's very painful and very confusing, because the body just doesn't do what it used to do, and it does a lot of things it didn't used to do. And while you can see how real that is for those people, when you put in the places of those people who are the same age, now just put on those benches Einstein, Arthur Rubinstein, Pablo Picasso, Rembrandt, George Bernard Shaw, Monet, Chagall, Bob Hope, Grandma Moses, and Margaret Mead. And you can't imagine them sitting around doing that same thing, can you? So it's clearly not age, is it? It's where the mind grabs hold and which changes it focuses on, right? I mean, Now, around that one is so endlessly fascinating, we've developed a great deal of humor around it. Johnny Carson, soon to be former Johnny Carson, says, "I know a man who gave up smoking, drinking, sex, and rich food. He was healthy right up to the time he committed suicide." Groucho Marx said, in middle age you go to bed hoping you'll feel better in the morning. In old age you go to bed hoping you'll have a morning. Robert Benchley said, "I feel fine at 50 except for an occasional heart attack." These identifications are so intense, it's extremely hard to break them. But as you heard, you could feel that it was possible to lift out of them and to see the body as a vehicle. In the East, you see the body as something you have incarnated into, and it's a vehicle that it's like a spacesuit for working on this planet, on this plane of reality. And your spacesuit, I have two cars. One is 19 years old and one's 18 years old. Now, to me, they're new cars because I remember them. But one of them just failed the smog test in California, and I realize now that it's just a car. But to be able to say it's just a body in the same way, because most of us have identified so with it's like identifying with your car, and somebody says, "How do you do? Who are you?" And you say, "I'm a Ford." You know, like I'm an arthritic. You know? Like I have gout. How do you do? I have gout. You know? It's the same thing. You're identifying with the vehicle. I mean, it's a charming old vehicle. It's just falling apart, but I can, with a little tender care, I can keep it together for a little while longer. However, when you get to the psychological things that change, it's a whole other ball game. Excuse me. What is my time on this? Do I have till 10:30? 10:45. Okay. When you work with the psychological changes, because there are a lot of new ones you face that are psychological changes. Some of them just increase, and some of them appear that have never appeared before. Let me give you a little list to play with. You handled the physical list well? Try this one. Despair, depression, feeling abandoned, lonely, worthless, frustrated, worrying, doubting, vulnerable, forgetful, losing self-confidence, petty, irritable, fear of the future, obsessed with possessions, meaninglessness, friendlessness, fear of being penniless, no one to touch, loss of psychological power, worship and fear of doctors, suspicion, paranoia. Those all sound pretty real. And they are coming and going and appearing more and more frequently and changing. As your social support system changes, as you may have to leave the home, as you may have to lose friends, as you may have to find that you have less responsibility, as the reward systems you worked for don't work anymore. You try to maintain psychological security by holding on to things as they are. And if you can hear the predicament that everything is things change. Things change. My car gets old. My body gets old. That's obvious. The hard one to hear is that thoughts and feelings are things and things change. And that your identification with your thoughts and feelings is another source of the cause of the suffering. What we usually do under those conditions is we work in a therapeutic sense, psychologically, to try to find some psychological model that will allow us to age, and we try to substitute that for the one that is depressed and fearful and frightened. It's a horizontal shift. And there are certain qualities that we look for, we try to cultivate. Martin Buber says, to be old is a glorious thing when one has not unlearned what it means to begin. He's talking about somebody who knew how to begin. He said he was not at all young, but he was old in a young way, knowing how to begin. And most of the social programs that are not for the physical body are for psychological well-being. And they are supporting education, the elder hostel, travel. If you read the AARP magazine, Maturity, you just see lots of stuff around keeping your psychological, mental health good and your physical health good. To continue to do things, to be active, etc. To see aging as a challenge, as a psychological challenge. A challenge that is sufficient to motivate you to grow, but not so extreme so as to induce depression, regression. In other words, not beyond our adaptive capacity. To psychologically study the way in which we are responding to change in a habitual way that is similar to the way we responded to change at puberty, the way we responded to change in childhood, and realize we're just reliving psychological patterns over and over again, and to break our habits and get out of those things. Part of the psychological mental health of elders and aging has to do now with political power, with the Grey Panthers, with the AARP, with power, with, as Zalman said, the baby boom and the power. Now every bus will be a kneeling bus because we have the votes. Now that's a good example of something that is extremely useful and important and relevant when older people say, look, we are not going to be disempowered by a youth culture. We're going to redefine the game of what this culture respects. And we're not going to wait for somebody else to give it to us. We're going to take it. And we're going to take it with our political power. That is great. But I want to represent another voice here and say, do that and do it effectively. Don't get trapped in it. Don't get trapped in worldly power, because the business of aging has some other agenda to it as well. One of the things that eldering allows us to do, or aging rather, allows us to do, is become more eccentric. That's a psychological shift in role. Before, where you had to be a certain way, now you can sort of let it all fall apart a little bit more. There's a wonderful poem that many of you know, I'm sure, by Jenny Joseph. It's a warning. She said, when I am an old woman, I shall wear purple, with a red hat which doesn't go, and it doesn't suit me. And I shall spend my pension on brandy and summer gloves, and satin sandals, and say we've no money for butter. I shall sit down on the pavement when I'm tired and gobble up samples in shops and press alarm bells and run my stick along the public railings and make up for the sobriety of my youth. I shall go out in my slippers in the rain and pick the flowers in other people's gardens and learn to spit. You can wear terrible shirts and grow more fat and eat 3 pounds of sausage at a go, or only bread and pickles for a week. and hoard pens and pencils and beer mats and things in boxes. But now we must have clothes to keep us dry and pay the rent and not swear in the street and set a good example for the children. We must have friends to dinner and read the papers. But maybe I ought to practice a little now, so people who know me are not too shocked and surprised when suddenly I am old and start to wear purple. That's, of course, T.S. Eliot's proof rock. I grow old, I shall wear the bottoms of my trousers rolled. Shall I part my hair behind? Do I dare to eat a peach? I shall wear white flannel trousers and walk upon the beach. I have heard the mermaids singing each to each. I do not think that they will sing to me. And one more poem that I found in a Hallmark card. Because of course, the psychological fear that we have the most is of losing our mind. And this says, just a line to say I'm living, that I'm not among the dead, though I'm getting more forgetful and more mixed up in the head. For sometimes I can't remember when I stand at the foot of the stair if I must go up for something or if I've just come down from there. And before the fridge, so often my poor mind is full of doubt. Have I just put food away or have I come to take some out? And there are times when it's dark out with my nightcap on my head. I don't know if I'm retiring or just getting out of bed. So if it's my turn to write you, there's no need in getting sore. I may think that I have written and don't want to be a bore. Remember, I do love you. I wish you were here, and it's nearly mail time, so I'll say goodbye, dear. There I stood beside the mailbox with my face so very red. Instead of mailing you my letter, I have opened it instead. I love my new bifocals. My dentures fit me fine. My hearing aid is perfect, but Lord, I miss my mind. Now, it's much harder to hear the possibility that one can extricate oneself from that which changes when the changes involves one's own personality. Because while you may be able to see the body as object, it's very hard to see the personality as object because you've identified with it for so long. You think that's who you are. And now we're getting more into the depth of the matter, because the question one asks is there a place to stand in relation to change where one is not frightened by it? Is there a place to stand in the presence of change where one can be with the changes, even enjoy the changes, work with the changes, become an elder, do all the things that changing involves, and at the same moment cultivate equanimity, spaciousness, emptiness, awareness, clarity? And that's really what the issue of the deep spiritual work is about. Now, there are stages of that work, and the first stage, I think, is the recognition of what is most comfortable for people in spiritual dimension is something called soul, which says you are still a separate entity, but you aren't the incarnation. You aren't what was born. So you aren't your personality and you aren't your body. Here are just a few images to work with in thinking about this. One is by Yeats. An aged man is but a paltry thing, tattered coat upon a stick. Unless soul claps its hands and sing, and louder sing for every tatter in its mortal dress. O sages standing in God's holy fire, be the singing masters of my soul. consume my heart away, sick with desire and fastened to a dying animal. It knows not what it is, and gather me into the artifice of eternity. Pull my soul out of the identification with the body. And in T.S. Eliot's poem, East Coker, as we grow older, the world becomes stranger, the pattern more complicated, of dead, of living. Old men and women ought to be explorers. Here and there does not matter. We must be still and still moving into another eternal intensity. For further union, a deeper communion, through the dark, cold, and empty desolation, the wave cry, the wind cry, the vast waters of the petrel and the porpoise. In my end is my beginning. You and I are paying the price of having grown up in such a materially oriented society, such an externalized society, such a society that measures people in terms of their products, their achievements, their possessions, their knowledge, instead of cultivating the quality of being. In the East, one spends one's life, from a spiritual sense, in preparing for aging and death. We have spent most of our lives in denying aging and death. And the predicament we face now is that once we become older, when we suddenly realize there is another agenda, it's harder to do it now, because it's harder to not be distracted by all of the changes that are happening in our bodies and our minds. And that is why you are encouraged spiritually. It says, die in the morning so you need not die at night. And that has to do with go through the spiritual transformations when you are young, so that when you get old, you will have built up the resonance within yourself to be able to transform the changes without getting caught in them.